Stand by. Apologize. Thank you for your patience. Okay, this is going to be one of my longest wins against the Goalie-Bot, a bot of 2,000, I believe is 2,850. This is going to be wasn't luck. It was the result of calculated patience. As you can see, it's a rook and king checkmate, done in a really accurate fashion. As you can see, online rating is only 902. Due to be playing games like this online, the anti-cheating algorithm has allegedly accused me of playing with assistants. So this is why at times I have to make new accounts and also handle different disputes. So let's get to the start of the video. This wasn't luck. It was the result of calculated patience, and I allowed the bot's complexity to fail. I maintained a simply winning structure, while maintaining the high efficiency logic that wins you cash prizes in many different aspects, in open tournaments, open board. But let us go. Even as you can see, the very simple direct opposition, rook and king checkmate, rook and king help a checkmate. So let us get started. We're not going to focus too much on the opening theory, but we're going to go more into end of the opening. So we can go king's pawn opening. I immediately respond with the Sicilian defense, pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3. I immediately go for more of a close Sicilian, d6, connecting the 3 pawn chain, e, d, and c pawns, pawn to d4. Always trading off the e pawn. The reason why, honestly, I don't really know that answer. I just know it's a sound to book theory, so that's why I did it. Immediately knight recaptures, going for a potential knight here, and going for a knight off variation of Sicilian defense. So immediately I go knight to f6, attacking the pawn, putting pressure on the pawn. My opponent immediately the bot goes freaking knight to c3. I go a6, going for the open knight off variation of Sicilian defense. If this pawn wasn't traded off, it would usually be a closed Sicilian. Just to make that clear from open theory, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. Bishop d3, just a English attack. Pawn e5, simply getting a tempo on the knight. The knight retreats back to knight to f3. More theory. I continue to bishop d2, preparing the castle, preparing my queen to c7. All that good and wonderful. Opponent goes bishop c4. e6, offering a trade of bishops. Opponent doesn't take, but wants to counter strike my backwards b pawn. I immediately say, hey, I'm gonna double attack your pawn. I'm gonna lose my bishop. However, that pawn is gonna go down because there's only one defender. So knight takes, and if I wanted to. To continue, I go knight take. Opponent goes knight to take d5. I take the bishop. Knight takes d5. Knight to b7, defend, and also continuously putting pressure on the e4 pawn. Knight takes bishop, knight takes e7, queen takes e7, instead of queen to c7, knight to d2, rerouting the knight, potentially to, let's pause here, potentially here, then if it goes here, guards the bishop, it goes here, guards d2 important dark squares, fighting for the dark squares. I immediately castle. Opponent immediately castles. I'm gonna need to go pawn to d5, undermining that pawn on e4. I would say, so not really overextended, but just putting more pressure on it. E takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight to e4. Discover attack of my knight. Knight takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. Opens up the f file, puts pressure on my pawn. The queen and knight are working together to keep the defense of this pawn, like have more dominance of the dark squares. These pawns are on light squares, so always just simply keep that. And the main theory I had to see that I started to worry about this why there's a slight disadvantage is because there's a 3-2 queen side up pawn majority, which if these pawns could advance up the board and more pieces you can trade off, like knights, for example, and that's the reason why I have a slight disadvantage. So I immediately go for b5, which is not the best move. Which is just simply just saying, hey, if you're gonna come on an attack, I'm gonna prepare as soon as possible, even though I make a backwards pawn and force my rook to always constantly keep an eye on the a6 pawn. Opponent goes queen to frickin' what's it called? Queen to g4. Immediately just pushing pressure on my g pawn. I immediately go knight to b6, just simply rerouting my knight, trying to put this on an outpost, and keeping a very watchful eye of this checkmating potential attack. There's a lot of pressure. However, I have a strong enough major pieces. I have a defense eye. I just have to play very precisely. Immediately go rook to d1. Immediately go knight to c4, forking both pawns. Immediately the knight counter strikes with an absolute technique. I was getting checked. Now I only have one legal move. Could take it to queen in my rook, so I need on is to keep king to h1. The king becomes e5. Now puts a tempo on queen. Slide d5. Pull that pawn to pawn and to just the king of the queen over and to this made threat on g7. So I just have to be very careful and precise. My opponent immediately ignores a threat on my knight. Why? Makes a brilliant move by having Italian pawn to get checkmate. On the situation, I notice the mate one, and I see a right triangle format to guard the pawn. So immediately I say, okay, I'm gonna need to check the thing, get an intermediate check, in between check, intermazzo. Immediately queen to e3. That brilliant move was very tough for me to see. Opponent goes king to h1. I get the tempo I need to run back down to queen to h6. Opponent immediately goes knight to g4, forking my queen and pawn. I immediately swap my queen over, saying, "Hey, let's trade queens to get into an endgame." The rook is still here, very pressurized. I immediately go and say, if you don't want to trade. Wait, no, let me continue on. No, I lost track. I'm on 23. I gotta grab my nose. Like, oh, sure. Okay, and immediately, as you saw, there was a pawn queen to e6, which was a beautiful defensive maneuver. It was a critical accuracy neutralizing the mate threat while preparing to simplify, which I would say is the top choice. Saw we're going to work up to rook 29. Queen to g6, off your queen trade. Pawn to b3. I take queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Simplifying into a 3-2 pawn majority endgame. Knight still vulnerable, and 2 rooks versus 2 rooks against a 4-2 pawn majority. So this is practically a perfectly draws position because of the either side majority. Whoever gets a pass pawn on whatever side of majority wins, or if the major pieces like the rook gets off the board, it would just be practically draw because no side would be able to make progress without making a mistake, from my understanding, theoretically. So I continue and offer a rook trade since I didn't want to simplify. Then my opponent takes the trade, rook takes, threatening back and checkmate. Of course, my opponent doesn't fall for that, puts the knight as an outpost, continues to put pressure on my f7 pawn. And the knight gets a nice outpost by my king side majority, so I have to be more careful about how I'm going to go ahead and make this attack. My king is still on h1, so I'm going to still try to get him to the game as soon as I can. Okay, I'm either go rook to d1 anyways to simply just gain a tempo and time, and to get my rook on a more active square. Now, 2 moves over, king to king to h2. I immediately go knight to d2, and my opponent immediately takes my hanging pawn. However, I go a check on knight to f1 check, which is forcing me into a discovered check loop. So check, he moves out the way. I check over here and fork those are called knight in the pawn and discover check, so the king has to move, so I'm able to create a double stack of b pawns to trade off the rook getting a isolated pawn. So I'm saying, okay, if you want to forcing and basically doing a forcing tactic to get double pawns on the g file. So immediately king goes back, I take, pawn takes, and we're going to slowly take our time. Now this is just me simply getting my king in the game, doing a forcing move, kicking the rook out, rook slides over, simply keeping a watchful eye of both like the b and a pawns. I immediately push my pawn on the freaking e pawn because it's passed. As I'm playing threat, forcing the rook on the e file to constantly walk on my e4 pawn. That's passed. I immediately go rook to rook to d2, saying, hey, if you want to take my pass pawn, I'm going to take one of your backwards pawns and continually get your 2-2 pawns from a majority. You're going to have backwards double pawns in the g file, so I'm willing to do that. And my king always has an escape square if and cannot get back grenaded any further. So that's why I kicked the rook out before. Where am I at? Okay, move 34. Okay. Rook b7. Rook to c2. Wait, takes e2. Rook takes e4. Rook takes e2. Pawn a4. Pawn takes a4. Rook takes a4. This is the critical move of rook to c6. Now this is just these pawns are completely immobilized. And now the goal of this game is my objective. I'm thinking I want to get my king here and make a offensive fortress here using triangulation, the rook, and the pawn to get this pawn to become an outside pass pawn. That was my idea. So immediately, rook to c6, king to g3. I immediately go rook and attack the hanging pawn. My pawn, the freaking, what's it called? Let me think. When it goes king to f4, simply ignoring the threat, because if we were to trade off pawns, it would be a 2-2 pawn majority, and there would be no chance of a pass pawn. So that's just simply ignoring the threat. I immediately go king to freaking f7, slowly trying to keep a watchful eye on this pawn to never become passed, and eventually stop it from moving, and trying to rotate my king over here to support my rook and pawn to get something to happen on the a pawn. Assuming rook to e4, I make the very precise move, king d5, to step out the way, start these squares, and to help out the rook and to continue by fighting against these double pawns, which slows the Goalie-Bot ability and time to make more threats and more passing. This is why this position is in a completely equal game. So, we'll just continue. This game is transitioning now from a calculus computation to a logical proof. Patience is the variable that determines the outcome of King of Pawns Endgames. As myself as a developer and a native engine player, and the board's constraints as a Marine veteran, I waited for the simple structural failure to manifest as a blunder. So, as we're going to go, d5, rook to a4, king to c6, simply just using a zigzag pattern